government services together in one place. Slowly but surely we've been able to do that. So just onto my next slide. The other thing that we're doing is actually we're starting to transform services within government as well in the UK. So this has been more how I've been involved with GDS over the last 12 months. So what we're doing is we're starting with 25 key services. So we call these exemplars, but they're different services across the UK government that we're now transforming into digital services. And you can learn all about this on gov.uk. We call it digital transformation. And we take every service through a discovery, an alpha, a beta, and we're moving these 25 all towards live. When I took this screenshot the other day, we've got 4 services in live at the moment and 17 in beta, so we're getting there. And the aim is to have these all towards live or all live by next April 2015. So just to move on to the next slide, the main project I've been working on is actually one of these services. So it's actually a thing called carers allowance. And the way that we try and work in government is to have people embedded in teams. So actually I've spent a lot of my time, as well as working with the team here in London and the Gov.uk team, actually out embedded in a team in what we call the Department of Work and Pensions, which is one of our biggest government departments in the UK, working on delivering carers allowance. So carers allowance is a benefit that people can claim and can apply for if they care for somebody else. So if a family member or a friend gets sick and they care for them for 35 hours or more a week, they might be entitled to claim carers allowance. So what we've been doing is trying to understand the user needs to build this service to hopefully make it simpler, faster and easier to claim carers allowance online. What we're trying to do is create services that people actually prefer to use online because they're so good. So the title of this talk, so next slide again please, the title of this talk is going to be user research, not just usability. And if you just go to the next slide, I just wanted to start with this quote. So Lisa Reichelt is my colleague here at GDS, she's head of user research, and she wrote a really good post recently. And actually I'd ask you to check out, we've got a user research blog now, and I'm posting blogs there and other people are regularly contributing to that. We're trying to share as much about what we're learning as a user research team across projects. Lisa wrote this post about user research, not just usability. And actually towards the end, she said this thing about actually, the problem is actually if we just focus on usability, we get to this point where we're making something really usable, but actually there's a danger where nobody was going to want to use it. And part of what we do as user research is just to try and make sure we're building the right things. Just to go to the next slide, so one of the things that I think about a lot is this idea of actually you can't design away complexity. And another way to frame that is actually user interface can't fix UX. And a lot of the time at GDS we talk about the fact that the UX isn't a person on a team, so we don't really have a UX person. We'll have different disciplines that help work on the UX, but actually the UX is about the whole team together. So the UX can be how fast the servers are for what we're delivering, but a lot of the time actually when we're trying to find out about the real problems in a service, they're not UX problem, they're not UI problems, sorry. They're more about the underlying service design. They're things like the business processes and the policy, and that's really what creates the user experience of a lot of government services. So, and the thing with usability, really, it's about whether, a lot of the time, the focus is on whether your UI works. So you take something in and really you're trying to see if it works. Whereas what we're starting to see is to really make better services, to design better user experiences for government services in the UK, we're having to go deeper than that. We're having to find out about things like business process, we're having to challenge policy. And really we talk about this as well. We use this phrase where actually we say we're doing the hard work to try and make things simple, but the hard work is going past just how the things look and feel to actually what makes them work in terms of the processes behind them. I'll show you a good example. So on my next slide, I've got a screenshot of it's the Tumblr terms and conditions. So somebody pointed this out to me the other day, and it's actually got a really nice UI. But I just wanted to make the point that this is something that we wouldn't see as good UX, because what's actually happening here is the design hides about 11,000 words, and if you look at that and equate that to reading time, it's probably about 1 hour of reading time. There's all sorts of stuff in there like community guidelines that you probably don't need to read at this point. So really it's just hiding the problem. So again, it's a good example of, you know, UI trying to fix a UX problem, and really it's about going deeper than that. So if I can have the next slide. The problem isn't always the design of the questions when we're asking questions in these services. It's why we're asking the questions. And again, this is something I've found a lot working on government services, and I'll show you a few examples later. One really good example is on the transaction I'm working on at the moment. So on carers allowance, we have lots of different screens where you enter information, and we actually focus a lot of time and effort adding better help explanations. So we talk about writing things in plain English so people can understand, so we don't use legal terminology or government terminology, we use plain English. We spent a lot of time making questions clearer, just making sure the reading length of questions was okay. We even spent a lot of time actually making the UI clearer. We focused on typography and hierarchy. But actually, as we've continuously worked on these services and done more and more research with people, we find that it hasn't actually stopped people finding this particular transaction confusing or unclear. So if you could just go to the next slide, I'll show you an example. So this is a screenshot from the Carers Allowance application, and it's where we're asking about other money that you receive as a carer. And this particular question here, we actually found from our live data that we get a 5% drop-off on this page from the transaction. And we were trying to find out why that was, and we thought again it might be because the question was confusing. We thought maybe we could explain it better. And you can see here just at the top, under where it says, have you claimed or received any other benefits? We've added some help text. We've linked to a new help guide that's really nicely written. And we explain why we're asking the question and we make it clear. But actually, now we've released this and we've measured the effect of it, we found that it hasn't affected that drop-off at all. And by doing user research, we've actually come to realise that people are still dropping out because they're scared they're going to lose money. They don't feel reassured enough that if they answer yes, that actually we're not going to take money away from them. And for these people in difficult caring situations, actually that really matters. And what we've been able to do is actually do the hard work again to try and get to the problem. So we've managed to get the right people in the room from the business that kind of say how the information's got to be collected for this particular transaction. And we found out that that isn't really the reason that we're asking this question. And actually through this process of learning, we've now got to the point where we're just going to remove the question. Because really it wasn't about trying to design the question better, it was actually down to the fact that we were asking the wrong question. So my next slide just shows really what is central to our work at GDS. So this is our design principles. So number one is start with needs. You've already heard me talk a little bit about user needs today, and you can see that we use this set of design principles. They're still what we call in alpha, so they're likely to change, but the one thing that won't change is we're always going to be starting with user needs. So the question I find myself asking all the time, wherever I am, is actually, do we understand the user need for what we're doing? Is there a user need for that particular product feature that we're working on? And what we have to do is we have to start with user needs. We have to try and identify them, and we can do that through research. And we need to try and frame them and prioritize them correctly as well. So that helps us actually plan how we're going to improve and iterate our products. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about process. So if you just go on to my next slide, really I wanted to talk you through a little bit how we do research and make that work at GDS, how we actually use research on these products that I've been talking about, and how I've done that working on the Carers Allowance product in particular. And really I just wanted to talk about the idea that really usability doesn't make things more usable. Actually, I do think usability testing is really important, but it has to be within the right design process. And really, the way to explain it is it's only when we take action on what happens in a usability test. And by that I mean it's only when we iterate the design and then we test it again that you start to make progress, you start to make the product better. So if you go on to my next slide, I've got a quote by David Travis. You might have heard of David. He runs the User Focus website. And in an article the other week, he kind of hit this on the head, and he said actually, usability tests, they're great for identifying problems, but they're poor at identifying solutions. And again, it's this idea that we're only going to find out if the thing becomes more usable the next time we test it. And it made the point that we don't get into this situation where we're doing a kind of test and done. And I've worked in environments in the past where we build the thing and we kind of design the best thing we can. Then we test it at the end. But that thing's only going to get better if we can then find a way of making agreeing on a way forward to improve it. We're only really going to know if that improves it if we then test it again. And it's kind of stopping you. If you think about it, if you know about Agile, you don't become the acceptance tester. which is the guy who just checks, actually, I'm just checking that it meets the requirements that we identified at the start. So the reason for this, and just on the next slide again, I'm just talking about how actually we're not that great at predicting what's going to work. And it's this idea that we're only going to find out if we iterate. So we're actually not that great at knowing what to do. And the only way we actually get to designing a better product over time, yes, we can use best practice, but really we actually need to keep iterating until as we learn and we test things with real users to really see what works and really see what works to meet user needs better. So just to tell you a bit about how we work on projects in GDS. So my next slide, I've got just again, just a little illustration of how we go through discovery, alpha, beta, and then we move into live. And hopefully you all know about Agile, like I mentioned, and we use these continuous release cycles, and it is that thing of building, measuring, and learning. So, you know, you hear people talk about that as lean UX, you hear people talk about that as Agile, but really we're looking to, even when we get these services to live, to be continuously iterating and measuring and learning and improving them ultimately. So they should never stop changing these services. And just the next slide, I just wanted to give you an example of why user research is important. So this is a quote from Tom Loosemore, and Tom's actually Deputy Director at the Government Digital Service. And I've spoken to Mike Bracken before, who's a director here at the Government Digital Service, and he's been along to our research. And one of the really important things is that everybody is brought into research in the organisation. Everybody gets involved with it. And you can see from here, actually, this is Tom talking about some research that had been happening early on in the project in Alpha. And really, it's this thing that when we get our research right, when we design it right, we do challenge assumptions. We learn early on and we don't build the wrong things. So I just wanted to share with you one of our main mantras, and that was this idea that user research is a team sport. So on my next slide, this is one of the posters that we use all the time. And just going on from what I was saying about Mike and Tom, actually, we're now trying to put in place in GDS that we're trying to encourage everybody in the organisation, everybody in government departments, to make sure that they see at least 2 hours of research every 6 weeks. So they come along to some user testing or some user research, or they come along and see some testing in the lab. And then it's just about involving the whole team. So I've just moved on to the next slide. So, and it's this idea that everyone can contribute as well. So it very much is a team sport. It's about ultimately, if you can get your whole team making better product decisions, it's good. Using user research becomes that catalyst, because you can get people firsthand. You can develop that empathy in your team because people are coming along and seeing real users actually interacting with their product. I wanted to talk a little bit about process as well. So on the next slide is just an example of one of our prototypes. So what we've done a lot of on this particular project, and we do a lot of work on this across the different exemplar services that we're developing at GDS, is we use functional prototypes. And I'm sure you guys would be really interested in this, in that it's about being able to test new ideas quickly. And when we look at it that way, as well as doing maybe usability testing on our live services, what we wanted to do is be able to iterate and test new ideas without taking on a lot of development time or effort. So again, it's this idea that people won't particularly know when we're testing things what they need until they see it. So if we can quickly test something by building it first, we find actually that's the quickest way to make progress. And another poster that goes with our user research as a team sport, I've just got a picture on the next slide, and it's this idea of show the thing. And we talk a lot about just showing the thing, or the strategy is delivery, and it's just making something you can show and test. The idea is it's better to show a concept than explain it, and people will get it faster, and you'll see if it works faster, and you can probably reuse a lot of that code, and you can work from there. And again, it's better to show people something than actually ask them what they want, because what they tell you they want and what they need is probably different. And really, just I'm sure you know about lots of different frameworks. So just on the next slide, really the point I wanted to make was that I always stress to different teams that I work with that we should use the tools that actually just enable us to build things quickly. So build off frameworks that you've got or you know. Like for the prototype I showed you before, we actually used the middleman framework because that let us use some local storage and create some dynamic functionality really quickly. We're able to just build some things into that. We've also got various GitHub projects which GDS have got, and we've got code bases that we can build prototypes off really quickly. The next slide just shows you something that we used to do that. So we now have a thing called design patterns, and GovUK, you might know, has always had a service manual. So this is everything you need to know about or to help you build a digital by default service as part of our service standard. We've tried to make our data and all our code as open as possible. So what we're now doing is beginning to bring our design patterns together using the research that we've done from across different projects and agree on common patterns. So things like how we capture dates or names or addresses, things like that, that even though we don't want it's one of our design principles, we don't want every service to be uniform. We want it to be consistent. So for a user, if they renew their driving license, one part of GovUK, and then they apply for carers allowance, a few weeks later, it doesn't feel like two completely different experiences. But I just wanted to say as well, at the next page, I've just got a link to our hack pad. So in our design patterns, actually most of the pages in there link through to a hack pad wiki. And this is an open conversation which isn't actually locked down. Anybody can come and join in with this, where we're discussing these patterns. And this is linked from the main service manual. And at the moment, what we're doing is feeding our research in. So if you go there, you'll see that I'm chatting on there with various threads, talking to people about things that we've seen when we've been out and tested some of our design patterns. And from that, we're gradually building up our design patterns library. But there's no reason that anybody can go and contribute to this. So I would encourage you to go check it out and see what we're doing and what we're discussing, and challenge us if you think actually you've got some insight that we've missed or things that we should be thinking about. So just to talk a bit about our process, so on the next slide I've just broken down, I mentioned before how UX was about team responsibility, but the way we develop things then, especially when we're building prototypes and we're trying to work quickly and just make things that we can take out to test and iterate, we break down our responsibilities into kind of the following three job roles. So we tend to have interaction designers on a team, so people really focused on the UI. They might be more front-end developers, even though we sometimes have a front-end developer sat with them as well. We have a user researcher, and they're very much be paired up with the interaction designer working together. And we have content designers as well, so we don't call them content writers, we call them content designers because we believe that content has to be designed as well, and that's a crucial part of the UX. And ideally, these people working together can work really quickly to try and come up with the right solution, and it's better than one person trying to cover all of these things. So just to talk to you a little bit about some of the different types of research we do. So on the next slide, one of the things we do, which is a good thing to look at because actually it shows how you don't have to have expensive research to be able to test your ideas. So we do what we call pop-up research. You might have heard this called things like guerrilla research or kind of just getting out the building. And we've got kind of banners that we take out that we have made pretty cheaply, and we go to places like public libraries. And this just lets us ask members of the public to test some of our government services. We found this is a really effective way of just getting a couple of researchers out to talk to people. This example, actually, we've done quite a lot in local libraries and learning centres because we know it's where people go without internet access to access some of these types of services. So it's a really good way of also recruiting the right types of people. We've also gone to places like learning centres in universities or places of education because, again, we know we want to test certain things with students, for instance. So it's a way of doing some research and just making that point that research doesn't have to be expensive or time-consuming. You can just go out and test what you've got. The other side of that is my next slide, which is about how we do lab-based research. So with projects like Carers Allowance and other projects that I've worked on here, actually what we'll try and do is work in our 2-week sprint cycle. So within Agile, we're working in every 2 weeks and then releasing. We'll try and go out into the lab once every 2 weeks, and we'll take our prototype into the lab and we'll recruit people, and then we'll actually invite the whole team down, so up to 20 people, to come and watch the sessions firsthand in the lab. And then the crucial thing with that is then how we then progress that back into the product. So on the next slide is just a nice shot of one of our piles of post-it notes. And really the crucial thing we do based on lab research is not only is the researcher team support, so everybody comes along and gets to see that firsthand, but actually we then insist that people get involved with the analysis. So what we tend to do in the lab, we'll use post-it notes and we'll write down insights on, say, yellow post-it notes. And then when we take them back, we'll do an affinity sort, which means we just sort all the similar sort of themes together. And we'll be looking for key themes within our research. then the really key thing is that we want our research to be actionable. So as a team, we'll agree actions for each insight from our research. So if you just go on to the next slide, you'll see that it's this idea that we're looking for actionable insights that are actually going to help us decide what to do next. And again, it goes right back to the point I made at the beginning, where actually it's about finding the things that we're going to change in our prototypes, finding something that's actionable that we can do next, so we can then go out and test again, or we can move into our product to improve our product. In terms of our live product, I just really wanted to quickly show you this photo. So how we prioritize user stories. So on the next slide, you can just see a picture of the wall, and you can see all those blue index cards, hopefully. So one slide back, that's okay. Okay, I think we might be missing a slide. So let's go on to using hypotheses. So the other thing I talk about quite a lot with our team is just once we're going to make a change to our product is actually how we can use that to learn. And one of the things that I think is really good to do is to use hypothesis-driven design. So you're using hypotheses to focus on learning. And this is another thing that's going to help you stop one-off usability testing. So just on my next slide, you'll see the slide you saw just briefly before. And this is just a little board I use for testing assumptions. So what we do as a team is that I make sure if we're making design decisions that we know that the assumptions we're making in that decision. So a really good example, and I'll tell you a little story about this one in a minute, is how we added a progress bar. So an assumption is actually that we need a progress bar for people to be able to complete a transaction. So what we've done here is listed out some of our assumptions. And when we make a release or we make changes to the service, we're normally able to measure using data whether those assumptions actually really create the outcome that we want them to. So it's possible to validate or learn from them. So I just wanted to make the point that, and this is the next slide now, that something that's usable, it's this idea that something can be usable, but it's not going to create the right outcome. And by outcome, I mean something that actually is going to happen to meet user needs. So I really quickly wanted to show you. So the next slide has got a photo of my original dashboard for this service. So it's a little bit more high tech now, but really the point I was trying to make at the time is that we should only be focusing on metrics that matter. So for a service like Carers Allowance, actually there's only really 4 things that matter. One, it's important that we create a service people prefer to use because it's so good. So actually it's meeting user needs, so we'd expect digital take-up to be going up as we make releases to the product and we improve the product. We want to increase completion rate because we know there's a user need to actually want to complete the transaction online. So we'd expect if we make improvements to the product, that completion rate should be going up depending on what we do. We track user satisfaction scores based on surveys afterwards. So again, we expect to be able to that to go up or down depending on the changes we make to the product. And we know there's a really clear need around being able to complete the transaction within a certain time, especially for this service because people are providing care for somebody else, so they might have limited time. And I just wanted to show you an example, and this is the progress bar example. So on the next page is just a screenshot of what the service looks like. So you can see from there, hopefully, that we had this progress bar design. So that's the next slide. That's the one. Okay, and you can see actually what we did early on is we went out and tested the progress bar, and it was usable and it was doing its job. And actually people said they liked it because we'd asked them if they wanted it. And it goes back to that thing of we kind of asked them if they wanted a progress bar rather than trying to see if they really needed a progress bar. And it was a good example of we weren't that focused on the outcome, and the outcome really was about, do people need a progress indicator to be able to complete a transaction for Carers Allowance? So if you go on to the next slide, you can just see an example of, again, how we listed out this assumption and the experiment we ran. So this is just a really simple experiment, which is why I'm using this example. So again, the assumption was actually people are going to need to see this to help them complete the transaction. And the experiment was actually we believe that if we remove it, so we hid it, actually we believe if we remove this progress bar, it's not going to affect completion rates. And we're only going to find out if that's true if completion rates stay the same after we take it away. So what we did is a really quick experiment. We actually just we made it hidden in the next release, and we tracked the difference. And if you go onto the next screen, you can see what the service looks like now. So it's changed in a few different ways, and you can see the design's changed a little bit. But really, the main thing is that actually we found that the completion rate was exactly the same without a progress bar. it really wasn't something people needed to complete the transaction. And actually some of our other user research was beginning to point to the fact that actually it was scaring some people away because it showed them so many sections they had to fill in. It's quite a long form. So there was a chance that actually it was having a negative effect on some people's experiences of using this transaction. We do think there might be a user need to know how many sections there are in the form, so we're still doing other experiments to understand this. But really, we were able to see that completion rate wasn't affected, and we were also able to see that it didn't affect how long it took people to actually complete the transaction either, and our satisfaction scores were the same. So as well as having insight from user research that kind of pointed us at this problem, we were able to then start to validate and learn using some of our data from the service as well. So really, just to finish and just to summarise, just on my next screen, I would just really encourage you, and I'm sure you're hearing lots of the same themes today about how to use usability testing, but really I just encourage you to try and do what we've done in the UK government, which is to make user research a part of your project, a part of every project. So have researchers on every project dedicated to actually running research every sprint or just regularly, and making sure that you don't work on everything for more than, say, 2 weeks without testing it with some real users. And then as well, just make sure if you are doing research, you make sure you get actionable insights. Agree them as a team, but make sure research helps you find out what to do next, and then use that as a catalyst to go back and test again, which again is this thing of continuously iterating and improving. Again, that's really the key part of the service standard we tried to develop at GDS here. And then the final thing really as well, I think if you can, try and focus on hypotheses. So as a team, know what you're testing and know what the outcomes should be. Therefore, you can hold yourselves to account, know what works, know what doesn't, and know what you need to revisit. And you can keep going back and challenging and testing those assumptions. If you do that, I think your services and your designs will start to come into shape, and actually we'll be building better user experiences. So just to go on, really, my final point, just to finish, was really, so if we do all those things, actually we're getting to a good point where we'll still be making sure things are usable and accessible, but hopefully there'll be no more one-off usability testing. And that was everything I had to share, so thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Ben. Live from London. We learned a lot. Bye.
Bye.
Okay, I'm going to talk. Bye. Should we take questions?